17. Community and Faith. The best-selling American book between 1880 and 1935 was a novel by a Topeka, Kansas minister, Charles M. Sheldon. The book, In His Steps, 1896, had an important point. A number of Christians in a community, under the leadership of their minister, pledged themselves as they faced their daily tasks to ask, what would Jesus do? And then to act accordingly. The book thus represented an important motive, and its popularity was enormous. It's still in print and enjoys a steady sale in fundamentalist circles. In spite of its success in sales, the book was a failure with regard to its purpose. Because the author had a very weak view of biblical law, at best, his own answer to the question, what would Jesus do, was, as a result, experiential and sentimental. The goal was to leave people aglow with an experience rather than to accomplish substantial changes. The telling evidence of Sheldon's failure is in an episode in the book in which a good Christian girl takes a drunken prostitute into her home in order to save her. Such an act by a Christian girl, however daring and however much motivated by faith, is still sentimental. To house an unregenerate prostitute is hardly good sense, and the religious presupposition that love will overcome is sentimental rather than Christian. Thus, the first step, taking in a drunken prostitute, is a sentimental rather than a godly act. The second step is even worse. The converted prostitute is then allowed to die, and Sheldon thereby avoided the problem of what to do with a redeemed prostitute, how to have her accepted in the church and community, and how to give her any social status. It was easier to ship her off to the next world than to find a place for her in this one. What In His Steps reveals is that the distance from biblical religion to church religion has become a very great one. Modern liberals find it easy to criticize these and other obvious defects in Sheldon's book. The problem, however, is one common to every segment of modern society, Christian and atheist almost without exception. The sentimental and bleeding heart motive is ready to reach out to the downtrodden, the social outcasts, and the despised, as long as the difference between the sentimental humanitarian and the outcasts is an obvious one. When the difference threatens to disappear, trouble ensues. To understand this problem, a problem of community, we must recognize that these communities of problems, including certain people. Every idea of community has a focus or center, and that which is at war with, or at least not in harmony with the center, is not a part of the community. The closer to the center, the greater the community. To illustrate, in a society of atheists, the Christian will be an outcast. In a community of army officers, a pacifist will be regarded with distaste. In the mafia, an honest police officer is hardly a welcome figure. On the other hand, if the community is governed by social status, wealth, and prestige, a wealthy prince will be at the center, no matter how irritating his many faults will be, because his status and wealth place him at the center. Every community has some center of power, a focus in terms of which it is organized, and the departures from it have no place in the community. In biblical faith, the center of power is God and His Word. In terms of His law word, all habitual criminals must be executed. Not only is there no community with them as criminals, but no life allowed to them. In terms of this requirement, a class of professional criminals is an impossibility in a state and community ruled by biblical law. The Marxists have recognized the validity of this principle as few others have. For them, only the atheistic socialist can exist in their planned society. As a result, they work to destroy by education, torture, slave labour camps, and mass murders all other resisting elements in society. By definition, all dissident elements are criminal. Their deadly flaw is that their line of division is anti-justice. Not only does it eliminate the godly elements in the population who are the most law-abiding and the best workers, but it also eliminates the communists who lose out in an intra-party struggle. Their idea of community supposedly has a focus in the Marxist faith, but they have as readily tortured and killed fellow communists as anyone else, and the issue has seldom been theoretical. Rather than differences of faith and principles, the reason for the bloodletting has been a power struggle. As a result, because their power centre has been power more than the Marxist faith, Marxists have been unable to create community. They have only a bloody power state. Community requires a common basis of faith and character, a relationship of man to man in terms of God. A very interesting account of life in a Japanese prisoner of war camp makes clear that, despite the common assumption and the cases of torture in some camps, our problems, reported Gilkey, were created more by our own behaviour than by our Japanese captors. The prisoners included too many people of bad or weak character, and the result was that the internal problems of the camp were constant and were a product of sin. In this situation, a new community arose. Young Catholic priests in their early and middle 20s paired off with the daughters of very conservative Protestant missionaries. Although normally opposed on theological grounds, their common faith now brought them together. They could trust one another completely. Their love became very deep, but never transgressed their moral standards, and they were a great help to one another, although the parents and Catholic authorities were upset by this relationship. A common faith, despite differences and common problems in the face of an ungodly camp, brought them together. Now, to return to the prostitute in His Steps. The problem of community was evaded by Sheldon. First, there is no community between a covenant girl and an unredeemed prostitute, although there can be charity. And second, community between the redeemed, the critical point, was evaded by death by killing off the prostitute. Lars or Sif rightly found this quote-unquote solution a false one, but his concern with, quote, social end quotes rather than moral problems again evades the human problem. By converting human problems into sociological ones, they are depersonalized and also removed from the realm of morality by the depersonalization. An even greater evasion is that of the modern mind, which demands community without faith, without any common standard. An example of this is the bitter indictment of the church by a woman who, during the Depression, became a prostitute for a brief time and then operated a brothel for 4 decades. Her memoirs are an exercise in self-righteousness. She deliberately left the world of the church and of the law-abiding, but resented the fact that she paid a penalty for it. We are no different than the rest of God's children, she argues. We are subject to the same emotions, the same ambitions, the same despairs, the same pain, the same weaknesses, the same hungers. The only basic difference is that the society from which we come puts us in a different, untouchable category, an ostracized class of fallen women who, if we are lucky and make our fortune, magically are socially cleansed and become respectable once again. Her memoirs indicate that she, as a madam, had a very strict standard for her prostitutes and for her clients. Did she expect the church to have none? Pauline's decision to open a brothel in her hometown was a calculated and deliberate one made after some planning and investigation. She told both her mother and her pastor that she intended to open a rooming house, hardly an honest statement. She speaks of having faith, but gives no evidence of a Christian faith. Her hostility to the church is intense, and she dates it from an experience shortly after opening her brothel. The most soul-shattering snub came from a week or so after I had opened my first house on Small House Road. All my life I had been a faithful churchgoer, from Sunday school classes as a child to adult worship and the teaching of Sunday school. I was a good friend of the minister and his wife and an admirer of his sermonizing on the need for Christian tolerance and forgiveness. One day I met the pastor and his wife on the street. In view of my new profession, I didn't expect an enthusiastic welcome, but I wished them a pleasant day. They didn't respond. They looked the other way and scurried across the street as if to avoid contamination. I hurried home and wept bitterly. Since that day, I have never been inside a church. I still have my faith, but I cannot tolerate the hypocritical attitudes of so many of the churches and the pastors who rarely practice what they preach. No doubt the pastor, as an average, more or less antinomian, preached a vaguely humanistic doctrine of tolerance and forgiveness, and was thus hoist on his own petard. In spite of this, what did Pauline expect? She had lied to her pastor, brought discredit to the church where she had taught Sunday school, and now expected no unhappy reaction. What did she want? An invitation to address the Ladies' Aid or a youth group? A blessing or an avowal of respect, whatever she said or did? Actions have consequences, whether we like it or not. With respect to prostitutes, the Bible warns men against prostituting their daughters. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 29. Priests were not allowed to marry anyone who had been a prostitute. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7. A priest's daughter who became a prostitute was to be executed for so degrading her family. Leviticus chapter 21, verse 9. A prostitute's income could not be used for paying vows, that is, as a receipt in the temple. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 8. Decrees of expulsion for prostitutes occur in Israel's history. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 24, chapter 15, verse 12, chapter 22, verse 47, 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 7, and toleration of prostitution was declared to be a sign of an approaching judgment and collapse. Hosea chapter 4, verse 14. An elementary knowledge of the Bible makes clear its position on prostitution. I still have my faith, says Pauline. In what? The Bible and the God revealed therein? It certainly offers no tolerance for her calculating and self-righteous career as a brothel house operator. Rahab, we are told, perished not with them that believe not, because she acted on her faith. That is, her faith was a living one. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. Her faith had works. James chapter 2, verse 25. She staked her life on her defense of the men of God. As a result, she had a place in God's covenant community. Even then, after she was saved from Jericho, Rahab and her family for a time were left without the camp of Israel. Joshua chapter 6, verse 23. They were required to remain there until meeting whatever requirements the leaders of Israel had for formal entrance into the covenant. Then she married well and became an ancestress of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. By faith, she had become a member of the covenant people, by faith with works. As an unbeliever, her works had been prostitution. As a believer, she had risked her life for the people of God and had placed her entire trust on the truth of God's word. Her faith moved her from the people of Jericho to the people of God. Her unbelief had given her a unity of life in sin, that is, a total dedication to sin. Her faith gave her a unity of life in terms of God's covenant and had united her to God's people. Community is an act of faith and communion within that faith. Modern man is hungry for community, but he destroys it by his humanism. Nisbet has called the longing for community which now exists as perhaps the most menacing fact of the Western world. The hunger for community makes man receptive to the pseudo-community offered by the totalitarian state. Such a hope substitutes envy for community and cynicism for faith, and thus furthers the disintegration of community. All non-Christian attempts to establish community ultimately collapse because of their inability to cope with sin. Sin triumphs in Marxist states as power, and Marxists devour Marxists in the struggle for power, which takes priority over the faith, the belief in the communist utopia. Any and every faith which cannot answer the problem of sin is destructive of itself and of the hope of community, because there is a faith implicit in all sin which triumphs over its rivals. This faith implicit in all sin is a desire of man to be his own God, determining good and evil for himself. Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. This faith is the antithesis of community, and unless sin is dealt with by atonement and regeneration, it will triumph over every faith. Sheldon's Arminian views in His Steps undercut the efficacy of the atonement and made love more basic. It's not surprising that in recent years, because modern man has failed to cope with sin, his strategy is to define it out of existence. It is now argued that prostitution is legitimate, and its prosecution is a violation of a whore's civil rights. In 1974, the first National Convention of Prostitutes held their meeting in a San Francisco church. Love had become toleration, and finally acceptance.